India's air pollution issue has grabbled international headlines. Air pollution is a global challenge and respects no borders. According to University of Chicago's Air Quality Life Index, the average life expectancy of those living in the Indo-Gangetic Plain is expected to be 7 years shorter than those in other regions in India if WHO air quality guidelines are not met. This panel discussion on air pollution current scenario, what we are doing well and what we could do better, will focus on how there is a need to make policy choices for addressing the health impacts of air pollution, on how we can use frameworks like CAQM and NCAP to aid the effort in tackling the air pollution crisis, and why air pollution as a topic needs more policy attention, not just in the national capital, but in different parts of a country. I would now like to invite Anand Sudarshan, South Asia Director, Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago, to moderate the discussion. I'll also invite the esteemed panelists, Mr. Gaurav Gogoi, Congress MP, Lok Sabha, Yamini Iyer, President and Chief Executive, Center for Policy Research, Anumita Roy Chaudhary, Executive Director, Research and Advocacy, Center for Science and Environment. Welcome, everyone. Pleasure to have you all here. Now I'll hand it over to Mr. Sudarshan. Over to you.
I just want to start by welcoming all three of you to this panel. I'm very glad to be part of this. I was afraid for a little while that I wouldn't make it because I was on a long plane journey that was being delayed, but I've landed in time. So I just want to introduce the three panelists. We have Anumita Roy Chaudhary, who's the Executive Director of Research and Advocacy at the Center for Science and Environment, which is, as I'm sure we all know, one of the leading environment NGOs in India and also one of the oldest. We have Yamini Iyer, who's President and Chief Executive of the Center for Policy Research, equally well-known think tank in this policy space and others. And we have Sri Gaurav Gogoi, who's a Member of Parliament and Deputy Leader of the INC, but has also spearheaded a number of efforts in Parliament specifically around dealing with air pollution. So I'm very glad to have all of you here. We have a interesting title, What We Are Doing Well and What We Could Do Better. I suspect we'll spend more time on the second half of that sentence than the first half. But I thought I'd lead off by asking you, Anumita, you've been working in this space and observing both the public discourse and the policy discourse around air pollution for a while. I think we can all agree that we've seen an increase in sort of public conversation around this, public awareness, media awareness. Outside of that, what would you say if you had to pick something that we're doing better at? What do you think that would be?
So, Anand, if you look at the way the entire discourse around air pollution has grown over a period of time, certainly, I mean, when we had started, there was barely any conversation. Today, a lot more conversation. And what has changed, therefore, is that earlier, when you could not get any response from the system and you had to be so much more confrontationist to provoke response, today, it's not that bad. I mean, today, a lot more engagement, a lot more consultation, a lot more awareness building exercise, and more important, the science around air pollution that has built over a period of time is also helping regulations to evolve. Now, if we are at this crossroad, then there are certain things that we certainly have to do a lot more better. And that is that today, while we are beginning to understand the problem, but somewhere along the line, we are not being able to deepen the understanding of the solutions and what is needed and how that needs to get implemented. And for that, the entire regulatory institutional response that we need and the designing of the solutions that is required, we have not been able to build that public and policy understanding. And as a result of that, what we are finding increasingly that people do beat their chest a lot the moment you say that, oh, health impact of air pollution, levels going up, Delhi, the most polluted city in the world. But you don't see much conversation around the strategies, and when they get stymied because of the lobby pressure, because of the opposition, then we are not able to garner adequate public support to push for those solutions, keeping in mind that solutions are no longer so simple as doing what we did decades ago, saying do CNG, no CNG. Now the solutions are also a lot more complicated with the sophistication of the technology, the policy design, the regulatory design, the new generation policy changes are very hard to understand. And that's why I think we have to. So, the second generation challenge that we face today going forward, it's very clear that the action has to be target oriented, which is verifiable, measurable, but deeper understanding of what needs to be done. And unless we do that, then we are not, even if we can keep talking about this top down knowledge system that has been created so far, good. With a lot more knowledge and science has been created. But that knowledge and science and even more progressive policies that we are beginning to see in India today, they are not percolating down to becoming the business rules of a department. And just not in the big city, the smaller cities, everywhere. So it doesn't get translated. So when we go out in the field today and we work with the departments, we work with the ULBs, and we realize that disconnect, that, how do you do that? Decide a funding, even if you give them the funds. Today, a lot more fund is coming out of the National Clean Air Program because of the 15th Finance Commission. But even if you give them the fund, if they don't understand what needs to be done, then our analysis recently when we analyzed that how 33 cities in India have spent their clean air fund, after the starting of the NCAP, we found that 70% of the spending is on road repair and road widening and sweeping, right? Because the whole idea of air pollution then gets reduced to dust control. Because that whole complex science of the secondary particulates, the gases, that the PM comes from the role of the combustion sources, all gets missed when the departments are deciding what to do. So this disconnect will have to be addressed now a lot better.
So I think that touches upon, an area that where I have been engaging with this system and where I know CPR has done a lot of work, which is kind of what is the regulatory machine that's going to drive these policies. I think, CPR, Yamini has written, of course, there's a large number of researchers who've been working on regulation for a while. I mean, and if I were to put you on the spot and sort of ask you to kind of summarize some of what you think has emerged from that, I mean, how would you see India's environmental governance structure and our regulatory structure as being able to meet some of the demands that Anumita is talking about? I mean, just to take one example, the idea of an NCAP, which is sort of a small amount of money given to different cities as being an approach to solve what is a sectoral cross-boundary problem, that's a product of, in the context of having state pollution control boards who have on paper some of these duties. What does that tell you about environmental regulation in India? And sort of, if you had to talk about reform of that regulatory structure, sort of what do you think we need there?
Thank you. I think you raise a really important question, which to my mind is at the heart of the challenge that we confront. And in more ways than one, this is not a challenge that is unique to the problem of air pollution that we are talking about just now. It is a broader challenge of governance, institutions, and how policy making and the public actually come together to identify and articulate solutions. As researchers, whenever you see a problem, the quick solution to that problem is to organize a seminar. And as governments, whenever you see a problem, the quick solution to that problem is to create a new scheme, set up a commission, and make a grand announcement about some kind of regulatory structure that you want to put in place. But we know from across the board that none of these things actually matter if you don't do the hard work of understanding the complexity of the challenge and then thinking about the kind of institutions you need to build to respond respond to that challenge. So at one level, I think the one thing that we certainly do know about the problem of air pollution in India today, based on the science, based on our some advances in our understanding, it's not a city-specific problem, right? It's not a problem that is a Delhi problem. It isn't a problem that is a Lucknow problem. It isn't a problem that is a Gurgaon problem. It is a problem that cuts across both cities and rural areas. It cuts across, air knows no boundaries. So it cuts across all kinds of administrative imaginations and administrative boundaries that we place, and therefore it requires an intercity, interspatial response. We in CPR talk about it in the context of an airshed response as opposed to a citywide response. But look how we think about the governance structure that can respond to it. We have made a very clear distinction between rural and urban, even though the biggest public noise that is made about air pollution happens in October and November, and the argument is it's not a city problem, it's coming because of farming, which last time I checked was a rural issue, right? So, we've created a city structure. We are saying we're going to fund the municipalities, we're going to create the city challenge funds, et cetera, for a problem that actually cuts across spatial boundaries, because air is not making a distinction between what's rural, what's urban, and the two actually are interlinked in more ways than one. So the need for a coordinated response as opposed to a siloed response is crucial. And this is not just limited to geography, it also deals with the kind of intersectoral challenges that create this perfect storm of air pollution that we see. So it has everything to do with planning, it has everything to do with agriculture, it has everything to do with industry, it has everything to do with urban transportation, it has everything to do with a wide range of factors, all of which need to come together. And in some senses, it poses a very unique challenge because bureaucracy is designed to operate on the basis of silos. That's the nature of it. It's a global problem. Whereas a challenge like air pollution requires all parts of the bureaucracy to find ways of intersecting with one another. And each sector has a very deeply vested challenge of its own to try and resolve. So we don't also have an institutional architecture that is able to break these silos in any government. And I think if you think about Indian governance and Indian bureaucracy, we tend to be even more siloed. And add to that, of course, is the federal challenge, because this is something that requires interstate coordination, but it also is something that requires center-state coordination, and it's also something that requires state-local government coordination. So the larger point I'm trying to make is that in all ways, the challenge of air pollution presents a wicked challenge of governance, and it is the perfect storm of all the governance infirmities that confront Indian governance across all sectors that come together in this context. When we create regulatory architectures around this, we are tending to do it in a sense by reinforcing precisely the challenges that we face. So the 15th Finance Commission, to my mind, is not necessarily the right way of solving the problem. Sure, it's bringing more money, it's highlighting the issue, but a combination of conditionalities, incentives, and pushing a local governance architecture when we haven't actually empowered local governments to even understand the problem, as Anumita was saying. So they're going to do roads, that's the most visible thing, dust clearance, it's the most visible thing, because we actually have never thought about how you create an environment where urban planning can actually be undertaken. To do urban planning, you need to staff, resource, and build capability of urban local municipalities, something that we haven't done for the last 30 years. To expect that a financial conditionality or a financial incentive is going to solve this problem is, I think, asking for a little bit too much. In fact, it's creating perverse incentives to do all of the wrong things to move money. We create pollution control boards as regulatory structures, but we don't think about the kind of expertise they require. We don't think about the staffing structure that requires. So understaffing, just basic things, are a huge challenge. We also don't talk about how the different pollution boards need to talk to each other and need to have a larger governance architecture that ensures that intersectoral engagement. And last but not the least, there is the challenge of enforcement. In the regulatory architecture, we often think of enforcement very much as the enforcement of last resort. So the last mile, bring the courts in and do the most the one with the most amount of teeth of criminality, whereas enforcement is about a whole set of other things: positive incentives for compliance, getting the rules right, and ensuring that you have a mechanism that puts in conditions of enforcement early on, rather than, for instance, as we have in Delhi, and it'll start up in October, the graded action response plan, which is responding to a problem as it's unfolding, as opposed to creating appropriate graded responses to ensure that that problem doesn't come in the first place. So I think just first principles alone, a good regulatory environment requires coordination. It requires moving away from administrative boundaries to understand intersectoral and interspatial challenges. And it requires the hard work of building state capacity, both in terms of human resources, internal accountability structures, staffing, and compliance systems to get the regulatory environment right. It's a problem that cuts across everywhere, but a discussion we need to have.
Yeah, so Yamini, but I mean, and I'll bring in Gaurav here at this point, because I think, there's, so it's a little telling that, so we've, we've managed to get people from from think tanks, from civil society. Gaurav, you're a politician. I've worked with multiple MPs over the last few years. Many of them have been very engaged and interested in air pollution. We don't have someone on this panel from the regulatory apparatus that is actually supposed to resolve this problem. Now, I think picking up from where Yamini, which I think is telling, picking up from sort of where Yamini left off, on paper, India's environmental regulatory structure looks a lot like many other countries. It is not as if air pollution is a problem that is unique to India. The United States has an Environment Protection Agency, paralleling in some ways the CPCB, and we have SPCBs. Now in India, what we're seeing is sort of there's a push from the political side, at least this is what it looks like to me, and in many ways spearheaded by you, for example, to come up with a new Clean Air Act. But if I were to ask you, how should politicians engage with the fact that we do actually have an independent regulator that is empowered to work across states, that does supervise state pollution control boards, and a fairly kind of flexible legislation in the Air Act? As you think about how you as a politician seek to solve this problem, is the answer more legislation, or do we need to start thinking about how the Central Pollution Control Board is performing, and how do politicians and the political establishment improve that? Is there a way to do that?
Well, the short answer, Anand, is not more legislation, but the short answer is to nudge the government in a positive direction and reinforce certain positive behaviors and correct where they are erring. And that was the intent of my legislative push, which was not a new Clean Air Act, but which was an amendment to the existing Air Act that we have in India. And a lot of it stems from what both Anumita and Yamini have said. The intent of my legislative push was to give more salience to the issue of air pollution and thereby link it with health. We saw how the government kind of overcome the design problems that Yamini spoke of when it came to COVID. COVID management was pretty much streamlined across cities, districts, towns, villages. If you look at the election process as well, it's a very streamlined process. So the government of India has shown its ability to come up with a whole of government approach, to look at multiple departments, to have a very consistent solution. So therefore, the importance of linking air pollution with health was something that I felt was extremely important. The preamble of our existing Air Act doesn't mention that. Even now, there seems to be a little hesitance from the government to admit the health impacts. There have been two, I think one ICMR study, one AIM study, but still often in the Ministry of Health in their earlier replies in Parliament would admit, and on record, they would say that we have no government study linking health with air pollution. And I had to push back with the ministry, and finally, the Ministry of Health claimed the data that ICMR has put out. And I think that's the kind of salience we need, not only at the central level, but at the state level as well. I think for every state and for every chief minister, he or she needs to understand the role of air pollution with the health of his or her citizens. It is the second most important contributor to disease, and therefore it should be right up in the top five health based issues which any state government should take it on priority. The second intention of my legislative push was to improve the institutional mechanism that Yamini spoke of, which is the central pollution control boards and the state pollution control boards. We had this legislation look at the staffing of the Central Pollution Control Board, make it more multi-sectoral, have more representatives from across ministries, have a much more higher level official sitting there. So therefore, you would be able to coordinate your efforts with the Ministry of Road Transport, with the Ministry of Urban Development, with the Ministry of energy for that matter, because there is an energy component, there is a waste management component, there's a construction, there's a transport. So you do need a multi-ministerial effort, and that's what was the aim. Unfortunately, all this legislative push did not result in the CPCB becoming stronger, but it in fact nudged the government in a different direction, and they came up with a new regulation creating the Commission for Air Quality Management. Now, many of the suggestions or many of the powers and functions which the Commission for Air Quality Management currently have, that's the kind of power I wanted the Central Pollution Control Boards to have, and through them, the State Pollution Control Boards and the District Pollution Control Boards. So lo and behold, typical, a design flaw. Instead of solving an existing problem, you've created a new structure, which by media reports seems to be very empowered to take decisions in and around the national capital region. But then in the districts, the states, the pollution control boards remain to be understaffed, remain to enforce polluting industries, to have monitors, are unable to understand what the requirements of NCAP are. So I think that there is a lot of work that needs to be done in order to decentralize this issue of air pollution. We needed to take to our states, we needed to take to our districts and do the same, link it with health, get more capacity building. I represent the state of Assam. I'm often looking for support from external institutions to kind of help in capacity building of my administration, local administration, and the districts. So it does require an approach which cuts across the public sector, the private sector, who are also extremely important, and the scientists and the research community.
So Gaurav, this response to kind of this push, that you've led to try and get, the regulatory structure reform to try and have health as part of it. As you mentioned, the result was a new framework, right? A new committee, and in fact, more than one. Is that, in your assessment, an indication that the government does not have faith in the CPCB and the SPCBs? Is that just, why is it that that's the response? Since you're pointing out that that's probably not the optimal response, and it would have been to strengthen the pollution control boards. When you talk to the Environment Ministry and so on, why is it that that was not what the government led with? And is it because they don't have faith in the regulatory establishment that exists, or is there another reason?
Well, I wish the government were honest and frank with me, Anand, but clearly they are not going to be. But let me tell you officially what they have said in Parliament exchanges is that the government takes it very seriously. That is the reason behind the huge amount of grant to the 15 Finance Commission and the reason behind the National Clean Air Program. They have listed non-attainment cities and have targets. But that's the rhetoric. The action is that pretty much the the response of the government seems to be dominated around the NCR, whether it's the shutting down of power plants, whether it's the building of bypasses to the highways. And you look at the Commission for Air Quality Management, the topic of this session is what is doing well. A Commission for Air Quality Management is working year round. If you look at the media reports, they are already putting into certain plans, they're taking certain decisions. So which is an important thing to understand, that air pollution is not a spike that happens in October, November. It's a year-long issue which requires systemic year-long action. And I just wish, that's the kind of work that we were happening in across districts and states. And this is an issue that we've been pushing forward, pushing since, let's say, 2012, 2013. So it's close to 10, 12 years now. And I must say, for the country that boasts of its immense potential in terms of governance and has very high targets for economic growth, for 12 years, if this is the progress, I think that's not good enough. We need to have done much more by this time. It is a matter for which also hurts the brand of India, the image of India, affects tourism. When you have 9 of the 15 top most polluted cities residing in India, what is the message that we are sending out? And surely, in an era where we are all sensitive to environment, we're all sensitive to emissions, we've got targets to fulfill under the Paris Treaty. I think emissions management, waste management, urban planning, construction management, I really think, we should have done a lot more. And maybe the government of India is restricted in terms of its design to think of it at a very Delhi level, at a very national level. But it still requires more nudging and pushing to really push down and work and create the ecosystem where at least the government institutions are empowered to do their responsibility in the districts and states. And I must say that the private sector has a huge role to play. The private sector cannot always be dragged and pushed into compliance. This is something that we should create positive incentives for private sector as well. If they are able to report their emissions year long, that is something that I've been pushing with SEBI, which is where they have the new governance reporting to make it mandatory for all companies which are listed on SEBI to list out what emissions policies are they taking out and what emissions data is. Similarly, we should have mandates for industries at the district level as well.
So I guess one point that we've brought up is this question of state capacity, if you like, and the kind of stuff we have here in the governance structure. So this is really a question for both you, Anumita, and Yamini, and I'd love to hear each of your responses to it. Maybe starting with Anumita, which is, both CSE and CPR have a significant amount of kind of research, expertise within these two organizations. Anumita, you mentioned that you think there's been a greater kind of openness to engaging with civil society now. Have there been ways in which CSE, for example, has been able to insert, more expertise or more research into the regulatory system? Have things been responsive on that metric? And can you give me an example, if so, and if not, sort of, what comes in the way? And then I guess I'd love to hear CPR's experience as well on the same question after that.
To answer that question, that whether we as an organization have been able to infuse more expertise or knowledge or not. But let me put that in a larger context, because each one of us, like CSC, CPR, and all other organizations, and if you differentiate and if you kind of segregate the institutions and organizations who are today required or are voluntarily engaging with the system and the government for knowledge sourcing, for capacity building. So this process and this ecosystem has now begun to take shape, where the government itself is now coming forward and saying that they're actually engaging And if you look at the NCAP framework today, so technically let's look at that first. They're actually listing out organizations today with whom the SPCBs in non-attainment cities should work with to source knowledge and for capacity building. So this platform has begun to evolve, and several organizations, given their own uniqueness, their DNA, and whatever their unique expertise are, they are trying to engage and give it. Now, this system it's not that it's something new. I mean, government always had this system of sourcing knowledge through contractual arrangement with a lot of technical bodies, right, and the consultancy agencies. It's nothing new today. What is more important for us to understand, that's where the role of organization like ours and others becomes so important, is to ensure that the whole knowledge sourcing doesn't remain limited to doing a report for them. We have to ensure that through a more hand-holding approach, you are able to develop capacity, and you also need to develop your negotiating power to see that the policy framing is actually imbibing and including the new principles of policies that are emerging today to address the new challenges. Now we are beginning to see that that's happening, but it's not so easy. That's what now, and here again, I'm going to say this with a caveat, because if you really look at the way policies in different sectors have been written over the last decade, whether it's the national urban transport policy, whether they are waste regulations, whether, take any of them, they actually read, and even if you take a new master plan of Delhi, they have begun to imbibe a lot of the new principles, new indicators, which are important to make an impact and for designing of the strategy. And if you look at the service level benchmark, the guidance framework that the different ministries are framing today. So somewhere along the line, that knowledge has begun to get infused in the system. But as I said, knowledge building is important. And therefore, this connection, this engagement between those who have the knowledge and the understanding, and to bring them and to build this partnership and through a more participatory process is certainly very important, even though there might be problems with even while delimiting some of those spaces of negotiation, which is also a problem. But it is more important to ensure that whether the institutions have been adequately empowered, like the point that the Yamini and Mr. Gogol have been raising, to actually effectively use that knowledge to make change on ground or not. And that's why the institution like us, therefore, have yet an additional role to play. It is not just about infusing expertise and knowledge. It is also to create the demand for change on ground, to which the institution also needs to respond. And even that will have to be done through a participatory process. And that's why a transparent platform that we now need to create both for knowledge, capacity building, and participation, that has to become much more stronger. And that's where we have a big role to play.
So Yamini, I don't know if you want to add anything to that from the CPR point of view. One, before you do, one kind of add-on question I had is, for example, colleague of mine, Santosh Harish, who then moved to CPR, was, I believe, working for a while on capacity building activities with the CPCB. Anumita raised this question of are institutions empowered? From your experience, from CPR's experience engaging with the pollution control boards, at least on paper, these are highly empowered bodies. It isn't that the laws that give them powers are weak. It isn't that there are constraints in the law. So, what do you think stops, for example, the Central Pollution Control Board from introducing more ambitious pilots or more sweeping policy measures? Is that a capacity problem or is that an empowerment problem?
So Anand, it's an important question you raised, but let me try and answer it in slightly differently. We're talking a lot about the pollution control boards, but to my mind, and I speak for myself and not for my colleagues who spend day and night thinking about these issues. The nice thing about CPR is that we're all an unruly bunch, and everyone has their own opinion and mostly disagree. But I do want to flag this, which is, I think, a big part of the challenge with pollution has everything to do with the fact that we have never, as a country, invested deeply in our municipalities, in our local governments, rural and urban. And a large part of the different aspects of the sources of pollution, the more localized aspects of them, have a lot to do with the capabilities, the capacities, and the empowerment of these local bodies. So, we still haven't resolved the basic problem of how to manage our waste, which contributes in no small measure to pollution. And we haven't figured out how to empower our local municipalities to do so. In the city of Delhi, from which all of us are speaking, the municipal elections appear to have been postponed owing to all sorts of political reasons. Think about what would happen if any government at the national level, no matter how powerful, would try and postpone a state government election. You would see the public and politicians screaming up and down, but municipal elections are not taken all that seriously. So a lot of this has to do with the challenge of the governance architecture that exists. The 15th Finance Commission comes up with a city challenge fund, conditional transfers, incentive stories, a whole story around local cities and municipalities. I don't think there was any consultation with local municipalities. There was a lot of consultation with interlocutors like us. And I think that is part and parcel of the huge problem. Interlocutors like institutions like ours have a large voice in engaging with policy, in shaping public debate. We play the role that we play to the best of our ability. But the policymaker's job is to talk to all stakeholders within the policy architecture and arrive at a sensible conclusion. We may disagree with it, and it's our job to critique it and push harder. But ultimately, creating those stakeholder engagements and building compromises so that you create a genuine implementation ecosystem that has genuine capacity is at the heart of the policymaker's accountability. And I think there it does stop short to a certain degree. So I don't think that we can really talk about effective enforcement, effective innovation, effective implementation if we don't talk about the empowerment. And there the word empowerment is important because it has a lot to do with funds, it has a lot to do with functionaries, it has also a lot to do with the functions, but also the overall relationship that citizens have with their municipalities and the relationship that levels of government have with their municipalities. If we don't even take elections for municipalities all that seriously, it's an open question how much empowerment they will have to actually think more holistically about solving these very wicked problems. Of course, overlaying that is a regulatory structure. And the regulatory structure, you're right, it has teeth when it comes to enforcement by law, but it lacks teeth when it comes to enforcement by implementation. In terms of a whole set of things, just the structure, the internal accountabilities, the degree of autonomy, who gets appointed, and who are how representative are these bodies in terms of the different stakeholders. And this is not, again, unique to pollution. We look at in CPR at regulatory institutions across both the economic regulatory environment, the social policy regulatory environment. It's a classic problem of bureaucratizing these boards in ways that these become sort of patronage positions or retirement positions, and don't necessarily have the capacity, the incentive, or the ability to be genuinely innovative, different. And then when you lack the staffing, any kind of enforcement by definition becomes coercion. And you then have private sector, just like we've seen this in labor, right? I mean, our labor regulation is a grand example of this. This is going to go down that road if we don't solve this properly and fast. It is going to become a set of vested interests between private sector and private individuals and the pollution control board over how much coercion, how much actual following of compliance is done, because there will be all kinds of discretionary stories that will enter the picture, and ultimately it'll be the perfect storm, like we see with labor law, where you argue factor market reform is really important, so get rid of all the regulation in order to allow the market to do the market's job. So we have to be very wary and careful of what we learn from other regulatory experiences over some over that go over the entire economic history of contemporary India, and think harder about what we mean when we say enforcement, what we mean when we say capacity, because ultimately you want to ensure that you have positive incentives for compliance, enough discretion at the level of the regulator to be able to make the right decision, but also monitoring in a manner that ensures that corruption and other perversities and perversions don't seek in, that then make the regulatory environment coercive, that brings in the perfect storm of private sector. As Gaurav rightly pointed out, private individuals and private sector play a really important role. And I just want to say one last thing. Ultimately, all of these pieces will only sit in place if the challenge of air is not seen by the public as a challenge that needs to be screamed about in October and November, and in December I'll be back in my SUV driving around. It's at the heart of the. I mean, I spent a lot of my cut my teeth working on issues of education and health, broadly on social policy. And when this whole air pollution started coming up as a debate, I argued that maybe this is the one moment when elites will not find private solutions to public goods problems or merit goods problems, and actually look for public solutions, because heck, how can you privatize your air? But it turns out that you can in fact privatize your air, and that means that the kind of episodic outsized noise that is made and the kind of solutions that are sought, to which political classes respond, are of a certain kind, which is why you get the commissions on the top, you get the pollution control boards as another thing that gets heard about, but you don't bring the municipalities into the conversation.
Yeah. So, if let me play devil's advocate a bit and kind of bring in Gaurav also. So, this is something that all three of you have spoken about, which is involving different stakeholders in, the role of the private sector, municipalities, and as you said, public demand. But, if I were to zoom out and say, okay, which are the countries that have made significant reductions in air pollution? Nothing about India's sources is special, perhaps with the exception of biomass burning inside the home, where we are at higher levels, say, than China. But if you look at, say, China or the United States, and you ask me what are the sorts of things that they've done to reduce air pollution, well, they've been largely top-down policies that have, not been the private sector reducing pollution because they felt like it, but the private sector reducing pollution because they were either coerced or incentivized. So in the case of, say, the United States, the acid rain trading program was an attempt to deal with fine particulate matter. That's a financial incentive to the private sector. China has used a range of policies that have also been top-down and fairly coercive. So Gaurav, when you're thinking about, for example, putting together a parliamentarians group, thinking about how the private sector gets involved, and having, I think all three of you have brought in this this sort of sense of, more consultation being required. Are we actually ever going to solve the air pollution problem because the private sector decides that we want to suddenly become clean and everybody is convinced that this is the first problem and the most important problem? Or are we going to need top-down regulation that's actually enforced? And, that's what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on that? Because I'm hearing a lot of kind of this sense of everything has to come together, and it sounds like it's very hard to see that happening, and not clear that that's happened elsewhere as well.
But I think that's the if I were to say it, that if we are able to implement many of the things that I spoke of, or Arunmita spoke of, Yamini spoke of, we would be able to apply a better government response to all public policy issues, and it won't be restricted to air pollution itself. If you have an empowered municipality who are able to look at waste management, who are able to look at transport based on renewable energy, public transport, charging, by reducing transport emissions by switching to either cycles or public transport, if you are able to have a district body, a district administration that works with local universities, local think tanks and researchers to identify at a district level what are policy solutions, I think that kind of approach and that kind of system is what India needs to tackle all issues, whether that be education, health, or air pollution. And I think air pollution gives us that impetus. Air pollution gives us that tangible, marker in terms of how well have we performed, because we get data, annual data. And as I said, there are many principles in the policy solution to air pollution, which are good for democracy in terms of transparency of data. Do we know, how much air, what are the pollutants in my local town or in my local city? Is there a public display unit? Do our even small industries, have we come up with the right technology, cost-based, cost-effective solutions so that even small industries, micro industries who are already quite impaired under the current economic climate, they have the necessary funds and resources to put pollution management units and pollution control units in their local factories? Do we have innovative market instruments to trade emissions based on credits? Do we have empowered parliamentarians, or for that matter, MLAs? So the group that you refer to, which is the Parliamentarians Group of Clean Air, was trying to create, was set up with the intention that we have a whole set of parliamentarians who are again quite passionate about this issue, but they need guidance, they need information on the salience of air pollution in their own constituency. And that is what we've managed to do. We've managed to give my fellow parliamentarians resources that they can go back to their own local constituencies and figure out for themselves that how many polluting industries are there. Have their district administration submitted a NCAP plan? Is there a greening plan? Is there a transport plan? What is the state of air quality monitors? Are they manual? Are they continuous? So you are able to create a much more empowered representative that is able to convene both district officials, state level officials, and even then meet the Ministry of Environment to take a concern related to their constituency. So I think it's a solution. It's an issue that is urgent, and it requires solutions that will transform India's administrative response, not only to this issue, but many other issues. And that's what we need to do if we have to solve the challenges of the future.
Anand, if I may very quickly just add one thing, I think to your devil advocate's question of top-down coercion tends to work in many settings. Why are we pushing back against that? I think that's precisely, exactly as Gaurav said, this is a wicked challenge that cuts across such a wide range of governance infirmities that in some ways have led us here. That coercion actually is only going to, in more ways than one, undermine the possibility, because even to get coercion right, you need to have strong state. Let's not forget that we have such weak state capacity in India that even when we often try to do coercive things, we fail because we don't actually have the ability to implement effectively. And it opens up this possibility of a deeper vested interest network of corruption that will cause more problems than solve them. So it is worth actually thinking about, many years ago, I was part of an exercise around education and health and rural local governments, where we actually sat and kind of mapped out what level of, in the whole process of delivery of running a school system, what level of government should be performing what level of function. And obviously it is not not a local government that's going to set standards or do curriculum reform, etc. And so there are some things that can be top-down coercive, may be necessary, and then there are other things that require deep coordination, both with the public and across levels of government. So perhaps an exercise of that detail and that engagement is necessary. All of this in the context of air requires an intersectoral a action plan creation, because there are multiple sources of pollution that cut across sectors, so maybe we may end up achieving both ends, both a little bit of coordination across different governments, as well as identifying what elements can be coercive, but what elements require genuine building capacity at the bottom up. There's no short route, which is what we hope to do with everything in India. We thought technology will be a magic bullet. We've thought all kinds of things. Coercion can be a magic bullet. They ain't one. Let's do the hard work.
No,
I think I would like to jump in here because I'm getting so excited by what Mr. Gogoi and Yamini have said. What it's also bringing out is very fascinating. If you really look at the list of the non-attainment cities of NCAP, there are several very small ULBs. If you look at Kalinganagar of Orissa, it's not even an ULB, right? And you are talking about doing air pollution action in those small local pollution hotspots. But NCAP has not come up with any framework of how do you do local action within those small ULBs. And what is important for us to understand, the small towns, they are small population, small economy, very small revenue generating capacity, and they just don't have that localized, what Amini said, that actually local governance should be strong if you really go by the municipal approach to governance. But it's not happening right now. But what is more important is the key pollution sources, industry, power plant, mining, around those small, tiny ULBs are not within the control of those ULBs. All that can do is little bit of parking, little bit of road, little bit of greening, right? And we expect the air to clean up. Now, that's where the big disconnect is. So today, one challenge is that how do we come up with a framework for these small to have locally appropriate strategy? For them, you do not talk about public transport, but paratransit, right? You talk about walking and cycling, but we don't have a framework for that. And the other is that we have all said that this coordination today is also about regional pollution. And we have not yet figured out how do you bring in the upwind and the downwind polluters within the framework of compliance. That a clean air action plan has to account for the contribution of the upwind polluters to the downwind regions and build that into their accountability framework the way other countries have done. US Clean Air Act has provided for good neighbor policy, right? Where you have to take into account this kind of things. So one, about fixing the very, the governance structure, which we know is hugely, there are legacy problems that we have to address. But this governance structure, while reforming, we also have to take on now these new generation challenges. And we have to figure out how to do that. And also take into account the fact that when you said that are we seeing change because expertise is coming into the system or not, it is also very encouraging to see today many ULBs, even small ULBs, innovation is happening. The way they are treating their waste, the way they are reorganizing their transport, and we are beginning to see those good practices. So that has to inform and tell us that what is possible from that bottom-up knowledge that is building up in this country today.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think, it is true that India is in the situation of being a democracy with limited state capacity, which is slightly different from both China and the United States on two different dimensions. So, our solutions, likely will have to reflect that. I take that point. We have only a few minutes left, and I wanted to make sure that I'm sure there are things that all of you feel should be part of this panel discussion that I did not bring up. So I just wanted to go around in turn, to just sort of ask you if there's something that you'd like to add to this discussion that we haven't touched upon yet. Maybe starting with you, Gaurav, and then Yamini and Anumita.
Thanks, Anand. I think I would just, I think, re-emphasize 2 points which I felt we could not spend as much time. But again, just to understand when it comes to local governance, and therefore, if we talk about the Pollution Control Board, if we keep talking about the central and the state and forget about the district pollution control boards, I think we'll be losing out the picture there. And secondly, when we come, and this is the concern that many of my fellow MPs have said, that we have this ability, we're coming up with this knee-jerk response to put a negative label on industries which are labor intensive but are pollution emitting. So whether that's the firecracker industry, whether it's the farmers of Punjab, whether it's mining, and therefore when you have knee-jerk responses from the government, which goes from the courts, when they go for sudden bans, a lot of livelihoods get impacted. So I think we need to have a much more careful thinking around transition to ensure that livelihoods are not lost, livelihoods may be transformed, industries may be transformed, and and many industries, micro industries, do not have the funds to put on those expensive monitors. So what is a relevant, cost-effective solution for those micro players, for the big companies, for the shells, for the big public sector units, the ONGCs, Oil Indias? They will be able to put out data, they will be able to participate in emissions trading. But what about those small units, the small brick kilns? How do, what is a technology and accessible and affordable approach? And that is why I harp often on the private sector, because sometimes they have to be the ones to come up with the innovations for their own sector. If we rely only on the government, the response would often be a penalty, or it would be some form of a rent-seeking behavior. So I think that those are the 2 points that I wanted to highlight.
Yamini, was there something you want to add that we?
Sure. I think Gaurav really hit the nail on the head on the one issue that we didn't talk about, and that makes me often feel very uncomfortable in a lot of the discourse around air pollution, is that there is a very critical equity and inclusion dimension to this that gets lost in the conversation, especially because in those two crucial months, this becomes an elite discourse, and eventually, and they have an outsized space in how public consensus is public issues are debated and consensus are shaped. There is a question of livelihoods. There's a question of life and practices that need to be engaged with and understood before shifts are incentivized. There is also a broader concern about imaginations of cities, and which sort of brings in this whole story of urban transport, etc., of safety. So, the big push to urban transportation is great, but if you're a woman in a small town, public transportation sometimes actually can be worse if you don't ensure that you have effective lighting, if you have proper safety, etc. So there's a whole set of factors that need to be brought into this. And I think here the role of the courts is also something that needs deeper interrogation. We keep going to the courts as the answer to all our governance failures, but the elitism of the courts, which is by definition the nature of the courts, means that the kinds of directives that are brought into the discourse on pollution are directives that are based on the experiences of judges. So last year in November, after nearly 2 years of school closures, when finally the government of Delhi opened up schools, the courts turned up and said, oh, well, there's too much pollution, shut the schools down, knowing, without even recognizing the fact that the vast majority of Indian kids, of Delhi kids that are coming into those schools, are actually sitting at home without the luxury of the air purifiers that our great honorable judges have the luxury of. So this privatization of air, the privatization of the purest of all public goods, has created a very, very skewed discourse that completely takes away from these very crucial equity and inclusion dimensions of the problem of air pollution. And one in which it sort of goes back to the earlier conversation we were having about coercion. I worry greatly about coercion because the consequences of that will be felt most by those who are the least causers of pollution, but the ones who suffer the health consequences the most.
Yeah, I think Anumita is, I just wanted to make one comment though on on elite, who the elites are in this ecosystem. I think, if you happen to be a farmer burning crop residue or someone running a small brick kiln, you may not be the elite compared to a judge in the high court, but you are certainly more privileged than a homeless person or a migrant worker or a construction worker in Delhi, who are the ones most exposed to the poor air of Delhi. So there's also, I think, this dynamic where we're used to thinking of farmers or small industry as being sort of the marginalized in this framework. But, to me, it seems like, in the people who are really being hit by air pollution, their voices are not even in this conversation, whether it's the judge or the farmer. There's a third party who I think is completely unheard in this conversation. But I also wanted to let Anumita sort of jump in, and if there's something that you feel we should have.
Okay. I mean, great points made both by Mr. Gogoi and Yamini. And what I would like to add to that is that let's be very clear that when you're talking about meeting clean air benchmark to avoid deaths, and air pollution related deaths are avoidable. Today, to be able to meet the clean air standards, and finally what WHO is asking for, just imagine how disruptive our action has to be. If you just go by our own national ambient air quality standards, cities have to reduce pollution by about 50 to 60% in many cases. Now, does anyone even fathom what does that mean to be able to reduce pollution by 50 to 60%, right? What disruption is needed for that? Delhi, where we say that they have stopped all coal power plants, no coal, only CNG, all vehicles banned, industry using natural gas, not small measures, and other cities have not done that. But with that, we have just been able to see 25 to about % of reduction, and Delhi still has to reduce by yet another 58%. So what more Delhi will do? So understand that the action that will have to be taken, and when you say that US could clean up, but that's an action spread over 50 years. And we do not have that luxury. So to be able to meet very stringent benchmark within a short time frame, like India jumping from Euro 4 to Euro 6 in 3 years, now that we have to prepare for that disruption. At one level, we cannot say that we do not need to take those stringent measures and we can take another 40 years to do that. We don't have that time. But if we agree with that, then how do we then reduce the equity impacts of that, that change? And policies will have to bring in just transition indicators, right? At the same time, don't shift pollution, but solve the pollution. And that's where the environmental justice issues are going to become very important. So that's another very important area. And the third area that we need to look at is that we all agree that we need multi-sector action. But a lot of things are already happening in individual sectors. But we have not been able to align that funding stream, those mandates and the targets that are already taking shape through those regulatory interventions to work for clean air. Then how do you therefore do that with a monitorable, verifiable and accountability system, and that percolates down to the lowest level of the systems? That's another challenge. That alignment is going to be absolutely essential, not only for clean air, but even for climate change plans, and we cannot keep the two disconnected. The final point that I just want to say that all of these will have to be done with keeping in mind that even though it's a doomsayer kind of a statement, but understand the opportunities in India. We still have a good baseline in the number of people still walking, cycling, using public transport. We have to keep them there. We still have a good baseline the way our small compact cities have developed. We have to keep those cities that way. So the new governance challenge is to actually keep doing what we have already been doing and not repeat the mistakes of the West that they have done, then understood the mistake and undone the mistake, which is much more expensive for us to do. So let us understand our unique opportunities and build on that.
Thank you, Anumita. Yeah, I think what's very heartening about this panel discussion, which is not always the case, is that I think there's a fair degree of agreement amongst all three of you on what kinds of strategies we might need to follow to make this happen, and it's obviously going to be key to succeeding in achieving those approaches. So I just want to thank all of you for. You're all incredibly busy, so I'm very grateful that you could take time out to have this conversation. I certainly learned a lot. I'm sure the people watching this are also learning a lot, and I hope we get the chance to do more of these events, because it is true that we do a lot of seminars when problems become serious, but I think they do serve a purpose. We all have to talk to each other, and this is one way to do it. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Anumita. Thank you, Gaurav. Thank you, Yamini. And thank you, Priyanka, for organizing this.
Thank you, panelists, for this informative and detailed discussion. Now that we have talked in detail about the problem statement and touched upon ways to address it, let's move to project spotlights that will give us bird's eye view of solution-oriented modern research and innovative experiments happening in this space.